Got it. All right. Okay, welcome everybody. Um, Greetings from Hong Kong and France. Are you in Lyon or Paris, John? I'm not sure.
Actually, neither, Dan.
Not.
I'm an hour away from Lyon now, at
Oh,
home,
okay.
in a
Oh, okay.
small city called Saint Etienne.
Nice. Okay. Oh, good. It's good to have this kind of transnational or whatever word I'm looking for on this. Welcome everybody to this talk um, tonight. My name is Dan Vukovic. I'm just introducing my colleague, Jon Solomon, who will give a book talk tonight. And I'm here on behalf of the Program in Comparative Literature and our Center for the Study of Globalization and Cultures. It's a kind of clearinghouse and speaker series, and sometimes we host workshops, things like that within kind of comparative literature, cultural studies, film studies, kind of broadly defined, but in relation to globalization, also broadly defined. Yeah, welcome aboard. We will record. We actually are recording right now, and we will pause that, stop the recording later, just before the discussion section, which has been our kind of usual system here. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Jon Solomon, who will talk about his recent book, which is called The Taiwan Consensus and the Ethos of Area Studies in Pax Americana, Spectral Transitions, which I will probably refer to as Spectral Transitions from here on. Jon is a professor in the Department of Chinese at the University of Jean Moulin in Lyon, France. And he specializes in not only Chinese literature, Chinese culture, but in his research, the critique of area studies from the perspective of translation theory, with particular attention to Sinophone cultures. Okay. In 2022, he published a book in Chinese about Hong Kong and its kind of movement and aftermath in 2019. I should add that Jon wrote the book in Chinese and published it in Taiwan. Okay, and the English title would be A Genealogy of the Defeat of the Left: Translation, Transition, and Bordering in the Hong Kong Protest Movement of 2019. He's also written recently a long article in English for an exhibition in Berlin around the work of the artist Sylvia Wynter, entitled Winter is Coming. That's a nice title. Black Communism, Translation, and Techniques, and a short article in French, The Outside and the Common, Between the Epistemological Crisis and the Historic Defeat of the Left, a plea for the transformation of the university and a new management of the outside. Okay. 2023, he published an article entitled Lucien Pai and the Origins of Area Studies and White Settler Colonialism. And that question of white settler colonialism, as well as the question of bordering and the Hong Kong protest movement, also relates very strongly to this current book, Spectral Transitions, which we'll talk about tonight. I should add as well, Jon, you worked in Taiwan, I think, for about 20 years or so, right? Yeah. Before taking your position, your professorship over in France as well. So, Jon is someone who is well versed not only in all the languages and the kind of theories that are germane to this area, but really with the places. And Jon is someone I got to know first before I ever met you here in Hong Kong some years ago. You published a thing in the Positions magazine on Liu Xiaobo,
That's right.
and you've done other work on him since. And you met him, and I think got to know his wife, etc. You have stories you could even share on that on this or some other occasion. But I was really struck by that one because that was kind of early on in me trying to write my first book around China and the question of Orientalism and discourse and area studies and things like that. And when I saw this, I was expecting something that you would expect when you see a English language article on Liu Xiaobo, which is something which either celebrates him or
Mhm.
kind of, extols him. Not that he doesn't have things that aren't necessarily worth, extolling and perhaps celebrating or something like that. But and it's been a long time since I read that. But what struck me was how you were essentially offering a critique of his, I think, some of his writings. I don't know if you dealt with the ones he was saying about like Hong Kong and colonialism, but also it was pointing us to uh, the phenomenon of Liu Xiaobo as a kind of global phenomenon, and how he was kind of caught up in these discourses around the framing of China and America and kind of anti-communism and so on and so forth. So it was it was a trip reading that, and then later I got to meet you, and we talked about that and many other things, and followed other bits of your work, right? And in a way, I would say that's even germane to this book on Taiwan, right? Spectral Transitions. And I will turn this over to you soon, but I do want to introduce you. And apologies if you're going to read this exact same quota, but it's the first paragraph in your book. And let me find it in my notes here, right? And I will just read this to everyone because it's, I think, a really nice actual overview of what your project is in this book. And it says, this book confronts a problem: how to write about a certain place without giving it to the ideology of the, quote, self-contained version, unquote, which is a line from Spivak's kind of classic essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? Hence, this is a book about Taiwan that engages in sustained analysis of objects that ostensibly have little to do with Taiwan. Not only does it show that Taiwan cannot be understood without a discussion of Pax Americana, that American peace after World War II that invokes the Roman peace, which is a form of peace, but it's also a form of continued war and empire and imperialism and things like that. It also shows that political ideologies in other nations. So you can't understand Taiwan without looking at Pax Americana, right? An important point, and a kind of structure that tends to get ignored, right? It's not just about the mainland, it's also about that and about many other things as well. Anyway, so it also shows that political ideologies in other nations cannot be properly understood without reference to the multifaceted population management apparatus of a global empire that is not opposed to, but rather incorporates post-colonial sovereignty, migration, and minority recognition into its mode of governance. So if you can grasp that at the beginning, that's great. But the more you go through the book, you will see this for those. So what Jon did very kindly for us is also provided a link to that text. If people have not seen it already, the original announcement with the Zoom link, etc., you can download the book and for educational purposes and read it yourself and try to get to that position, right? So what I like about that is how this is a book about Taiwan, but it becomes immediately a book about actually all these other things as well, which actually are meant to be foregrounded in your analysis, right? So if I can, I'm going to reference a Raymond Carver story that I always teach these current fall semesters. And it's what we talk about when we talk about love, right? And it's such a brilliant title as well as story, because it's getting us at this level of a kind of meta commentary and meta understanding of what we're doing. So I feel like you could apply this to the question of Taiwan, I think, and what you're doing in this book as well, right? So what do we talk about? What should we talk about when we talk about Taiwan, right? So yeah, I have, I'll return to this after your presentation, and we'll also open this up for questions. But thanks you very much, Jon, for coming here and for writing this book. Right, over to you.
Okay, great. It's such an honor and a pleasure for me to be invited here to give this talk. I'm especially looking forward to a dialogue that with Dan in particular that is already he's already kicked off. I've read quite a bit of Dan's work, and it's very inspiring for me. And you're looking now at the cover for my most recent book in English that I'm going to present today. But Dan just mentioned this book that I published last year, at the beginning of last year in Chinese, which deals with some of the same issues, not entirely, but in the context of Hong Kong, and particularly the 2019 anti-ELAB movement. I just wanted to call attention to that. That's pretty easy to find in PDF format. And if you can't find it, I'd welcome you to write me about that. And so I'd love at some point, obviously this isn't the moment for that, but I'd love at some point to have a dialogue with Dan around his now not so recent book, After Autonomy, which I think is very, very important. And in a sense, what I try to do in this book, the Taiwan Consensus and the Ethos of Area Studies in Pax Americana, Spectral Transitions, is very similar in spirit to what Dan does in After Autonomy and in other parts of his work, that one of his respondents, I think, quite fairly characterized as reading against the grain, reading against the grain. And I think that's what I try to do too, at a moment when that kind of reading is in short supply and, geez, I mean, potentially even risky. Everything nowadays is becoming so risky. So not to claim that anything in particular is risky, but everything now, I mean, anything that departs from the mainstream narrative in any field, whatever it may be, and that includes not just popular culture, but also academic discourse. Anything that departs from that is risky. And so what I want to do is present this book, and it's a 500-page book, including the tour de force forward written by Naoki Sakai that is itself, I think, 50 or 60 pages, and that really could stand on its own, both not only as an introduction to my book, but also as an introduction to Naoki's entire career, which plays a really pivotal role in my intellectual development and the arguments I present in the Taiwan Consensus. So obviously I'm not going to be able to present the entire work. But basically what I want to do is there are two parallel tracks in the book. One is a critique of area studies, and the other is a critique of Taiwan, the Taiwan Consensus. And this parallel is given away by the title of the book, right? And so I want to just kind of go into each of those different aspects. Let me start off with what I call the Taiwan Consensus. It's actually not me who calls it that, Taiwan 共识, or if you prefer mainland PRC pronunciation, Taiwan 共识, which I break down into a number of different key elements, including neoliberalism and heteronomy as opposed to autonomy, which is actually one of the themes of Dan's book, After Autonomy. I place the Taiwan Consensus in the context of the Washington Consensus, but then I redefine the Washington Consensus and understand it not simply in the definition. I mean, there's a whole genealogy of the term, but not simply in like the common critical definition that's like given by Joseph Stiglitz, for instance, but understood more in a larger sense as the unipolar moment of US neocon strategy after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the post-communist era, And then beyond that, also more broadly, a genealogy of parafascism in the United States in the 20th century, going back to the sources of the United States in settler colonialism and its bifurcation into settler empire overseas and settler democracy at home. So all of that is encompassed in what I call the Washington Consensus. I do deal with this hallowed problem of agency that is often kind of oversighted by people defending whatever cause of the moment against what they see as critiques of imperialism, sometimes in completely justified ways. But I just want to note, and I have many more explanations of it at a theoretical level and a concrete contextual level, that agency is something that occurs downstream of subjectivation. So if we talk about the agency of a certain, for instance, national people, we need to also look at the processes by which the national people becomes a national people, because that's not something that's just given and natural, despite, of course, the discourse of nationalism in each of the different nation states, which of course is a naturalizing mythology, right? Okay, so that's a second point that goes into my dissection or analysis of the Taiwan Consensus. Then we have, I look at civilian militias and social mobilization that's developing a kind of system today in Taiwan that's getting close to a total mobilization system, and really is now most completely realized on digital platforms, which are largely privatized. So I look extensively at the role of privatized digital platforms, so-called disinformation, and the way that that is a political manipulation. I don't relate it to any specific political position or political party, but more to the disappearance of the very possibility of a social critique that's aimed at the social totality. That was typically an approach used by Marxists throughout the end of the 19th and 20th century until the collapse of communism. And that particular problem has been theorized extensively by Frederick Jameson. And then also I have a long part where I consider the transition after the fall of communism to the human rights discourse after 1989 that becomes the dominant discourse of civil society, global civil society. And the problem of transitional justice and the actual mechanisms of transitional justice in Taiwan. In that work, I'm deeply inspired by the work of Robert Meister. And basically, I show how behind the discourse of transitional justice in Taiwan, there's a continuity with the past, in particular the anti-communism, let's call it the fascist anti-communism of the past that today all Taiwanese advocates of Taiwanese independence or self-determination necessarily believe is something that's now fully in the past. It's the Chiang Kai-shek martial law era, and then today that has nothing to do with democratic Taiwan. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do is to tease out some of those continuities in a work that is theoretically and methodologically motivated by a methodology of discontinuity. And there's a lot to talk about what the methodology of discontinuity entails. Some of that is discussed at length by Naoki Sakai in his foreword. Now, in my book, it's probably worth mentioning this. In my book, I discuss at various moments the historical experience of Eastern and Central Europe, and particularly Ukraine, and especially the US role in unscrupulously fomenting and weaponizing Galician nationalism among the Ukrainian diaspora that was admitted to North America, Canada, and the United States after World War II, in ways that enabled those communities to avoid any reckoning with their involvement in anti-communist, anti-Semitic ethnic genocide. Unfortunately, prior to publication, I wasn't fully aware of the extensive links between the Ukrainian fascist anti-communist diaspora, neoconservatives and conservatives in the United States, and Chiang Kai-shek's fascist regime in Taiwan. Well, I do refer somewhat vaguely to the fascist anti-communist alliances sealed among Chiang's regime, East European diasporas, and Latin American death squads around the World Anti-Communist League. It would have strengthened the argument to point out the deep historical links mediated by the US national security state between the Ukrainian diaspora and Chiang Kai-shek's regime. And from there, to mention the affiliation that continues to the present day of this fascist anti-communist lineage, symbolized most recently by the visit, this is post-publication, of Paula Dobryansky. She's a former state official, a former official at the head of a delegation from the Neocon Center for a New American Century, and CNAS. She's the daughter of Lev Dobryansky, who's a major representative of the fascist anti-communist Ukrainian diaspora in the United States. He's one of the founders of the infamous Captive Nations Committee that recycled Nazi plans for East Europe into US calls to decolonize the USSR that are receiving an echo today and in academia. Now, Lev Dobryansky met with Chiang Kai-shek in Taipei and was one of at least 3 high-ranking Ukrainians whom I can confirm traveled to Taiwan during the 50s and 60s. Dobryansky's work on the National Captive Nations Committee became the precursor of today's Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation that supports the work, for instance, of Adrian Zenz. Another important figure was Yaroslav Stetsko. He was Stepan Bandera's right-hand man who was implicated in the massacre of Jews in Lviv. During World War II, Stetsko notoriously proclaimed in July 1941, this is just several weeks after the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, led by Hitler's Wehrmacht, that Ukraine should adopt German methods of handling the Jewish question. And it's good to recall that the extermination of Jews, not just the internment of European Jews, but the extermination of Jews begins in Soviet Ukraine after June 1941 and is led primarily, well, of course, by the German Einsatzgruppen, but also by these Ukrainian fascist anti-communists. Stetsko visited Taipei as a representative of the bloc of anti-Bolshevik nations, the ABN. There's a photo of him posing with Chiang Kai-shek as well. The ABN also helped train CKS white terror squads at the Political Warfare College, Fuxingang. Apparently, the CIA director for Taiwan at the time, Ray Klein, was the go-between. So, unfortunately, there are very few people today who are aware of these historical antecedents to the contemporary situation. So while we hear often today this line like, today Ukraine, tomorrow Taiwan, this is very common in Taiwan, but also outside of Taiwan, the pairing between Taiwan and Ukraine isn't something of primarily analogical significance that resulted from an accident of history unleashed by an alleged megalomaniac in the Kremlin, but is rather an integral part of the para-fascist population management strategies, articulating imperial nationalism to post-colonial nationalism employed by Pax Americana at home and abroad since the beginning of the Cold War. I'm just gonna shift now what I'm sharing to show a couple pictures. Here's Lev Dobryansky shaking Chiang Kai-shek's hand in Taipei. Here's the infamous Yaroslav Stetsko. I mean, they're both infamous, but Stetsko really has blood on his hands. They're posing with another dude with blood on his hands. That's Chiang Kai-shek in Taipei. And there's Lev's daughter in a recent visit, shaking hands with Joseph Wu, the foreign minister of the government of the Republic of China in Taiwan. So I'll now step out of that share and go back to the book here. Thanks for your patience. Okay, so that's the critique of area studies. The critique of the Taiwan Consensus. I also then, right, okay, so that's that part of the book. Then the other part of the book is a sustained critique of area studies. And of course, the relation between the two parts of the book is essential. It's extremely important that the two books are placed together and intermeshed, because otherwise you would have a mistaken impression, the reader would have the mistaken impression that you could talk about one without talking about the other, which is the norm today. And what I'm trying to suggest is that the minimum of a decolonial ethics in China studies or Taiwan studies or area studies today is to begin also in parallel with a critique of area studies. Having said that, what I need to do is explain what that means. This is different from a critique of area studies in relation to the national security state that has been done repeatedly in China studies since the late 1960s. The Association of Concerned Asian Scholars, or the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars, up to positions. So you have a whole series of critiques of the birth basically of area studies in the needs of the national security state. Instead, what I try to do is to ask questions about the organization of the modern world, tying together disparate levels such as the epistemic, the geopolitical, and the linguistic, in terms that are more fundamental than those of the intervention of the national security state. It might be useful then to point out how my critique is different from Orientalism, though it incorporates elements of Orientalism. Orientalism is a critical project focused on power relations in the construction of knowledge about societies that have been othered by colonialism. So my focus is not just on power relations in knowledge, but on the role of knowledge production and other social practices. I focus especially on translation, but I also look extensively at finance in the construction of modern areas that take linguistic community as their model. So I actually call into question how it is that self and other become self and other. In terms of the national security state itself, my book doesn't treat this as a merely historical question related to the past, that is the Cold War, but instead I look at it as one, in terms of transitions, in the way the national security state is organized and operates both independently and in relation to knowledge production, including institutions such as think tanks, foundations, financial markets, and the media that are inside and outside of academia. I also look at the transition, the historical transition, moving from what I call the period of Dullicism to that of neoliberal financialization. And I suggest that area studies today cannot be understood, particularly China studies, cannot be understood without understanding neoliberal financialization. and there's a lot more to say about that. And then also, finally, how the national security state is implicated in the founding exclusions of the field. Those founding exclusions are primarily consist of anti-Blackness and anti-communism. And the way those exclusions have evolved at the epistemic level. This leads me to a discussion of what I call the epistemology of the secret. I look at this in various different contexts. I look at this beginning in the Cold War in the context of what I call Dullicism, which is basically the context of Cold War covert operations. And so I look at the role of the secret in general in Dullicism. I then also look at the role of the secret in neoliberalism, and particularly in digital culture, which is a very, very different context from Dullicism. I then also look at how the secret plays a fundamental role in area studies through a regime of visibility that I go at through Jacques Derrida's analysis of the visor effect and its relation to the construction of Pax Americana that he critiques in his early 1990s book, Specters of Marx. And also, secondly, a regime of translation, what Naoki Sakai calls the modern regime of translation. These two regimes, the regime of visibility or the regime of the visor effect, and the modern regime of translation, are part of a structure that I call the structure of the alibi, that constitutes the positionality of the area studies scholar that is most faithfully reproduced by China studies scholars. I can give a couple examples of recent work that would illustrate my difference from recent work and help illustrate where there's a divergence here. One of those would be Margaret Hillenbrand's recent work published in 2020 by Duke University Press called Negative Exposures, Knowing What Not to Know in Contemporary China. So it's the longest chapter in my book, the Taiwan Consensus and the Ethos of, the longest chapter in my book, it's I think the third chapter, is devoted to an examination of the epistemology of the secret in relation to area studies. I look at its object of study, I look at conspiracy theories, I look at historical trauma, I look at transitional justice, neoliberalism, and aesthetics. Hillenbrand's book, Negative Exposures, deals with many of the same issues. Much to her credit, Hillenbrand is highly aware of the fact that the phenomenon her book sets out to study are hardly limited to China, but enjoy a global dimension. This is one of the common themes now of China studies in the contemporary era, so-called global China, which one might expect would represent a departure from the structure of the alibi, and particularly the trope of isolation of China, where one focuses only on China and decontextualizes China, and any attempt to contextualize China is called whataboutism. One might think that this is a departure from that, but I'm not so sure. The most important clue concerning this apparent contradiction is found in the lack of a reflexive approach. And Hillenbrand's book never broaches the question of whether and how the epistemology of the secret operates within the discipline of China studies itself. Obviously, to pose this question would be to admit that a certain relationship necessarily exists between the aesthetics of the public secret in China, which is really what her book is about, and the aesthetics of secrecy and conspiracy that have motivated disciplinary China studies since the 1950s up to the present. Once we admit that this relation exists or might exist, we would then have to allow for the possibility that China studies are inscribed in the same aesthetics of the public secret in China within the same colonial imperial formation of modernity. Hence, the aesthetics of the public secret, as Hillenbrand calls it in China, must inevitably be seen as a response to the colonial epistemology institutionalized and transmitted by China studies. China studies can't be assumed to be external to this problem of what China scholars call the cryptocracy of the party state today. The cryptocracy meaning this extremely secretive, undemocratic power, non-transparent power, where transparency is equated with democracy. I have a critique of that in the section where I deal with privatized digital platforms, but I won't go into that. Under such circumstances, the critic who imagines herself to occupy a position of exteriority in relation to the phenomena she studies becomes a sign of ideological deformation. So this isn't simply a question of ethics, but goes to the heart of the political issues that Hillenbrand raises, and in a sense are at the heart of China studies today. For while Hillenbrand refers on numerous occasions to the surveillance and secrecy that characterize liberal democracies, this is part of the discourse of global China, something that is happening in China is also happening elsewhere or is related directly. There are Western corporations that are dealing with these Chinese corporations that are feeding the surveillance state all around the globe. She is simply still not interested in figuring out how China studies itself, the institution, and the epistemology of the secret that rules over that field plays not just an active role somewhere on the margins, but is actually an irreplaceable central player in the maintenance of the ideological deformations that sustain liberal hegemony. In other words, China studies isn't just a privileged place for understanding the regime of the public secret in China and the repressive illiberal regime in China. It is also, and perhaps more so, arguably more so, a privileged place for understanding the ideological deformations that constitute and sustain liberal imperial hegemony. One of the central knots in that ideological hegemony concerns the historical valence of the term authoritarianism. Unfortunately, the genealogy of the concept of authoritarianism is a work that has yet to be written. So it's necessary for us to piece it together from a disparate series of works among which we can connect the dots, which I'll try to do here. This is also supplementary to my book. Etymological dictionaries place the emergence of the term authoritarian in English sometime during the second half of the 19th century. The Oxford English Dictionary puts the origin earlier than some others, who generally put the origin in the 1870s. Regardless of the actual origin of the term, its circulation roughly corresponds with the period of post-Civil War Reconstruction in the United States. This is a really key time in US history, a moment when the possibility of putting an end to settler colonialism and of creating a truly multiracial democratic state was, for a brief evanescent moment in US history, a political reality. Sadly, this possibility was crushed in the late 19th century by an emerging political consensus that evolved into what we now call the two-party system, or more cynically, the duopoly that runs US politics. The only challenge to the duopoly over the past century and a half since Reconstruction was the People's Party, led by Tom Watson, who advocated a class-based coalition across racial lines. I talk about this in the section where I talk about Dullicism, because this is an important part of the construction of the Cold War liberal mentality, the Cold War liberal position that feeds into what I then call today's NATO left. Watson's campaign was defeated in large part by smearing Watson, by calling him a racist. This is when the term populist and populism became directly associated with authoritarian. That's something that's been charted out. That's a history that's been charted out by Thomas Frank in a book called The People Know. Throughout the beginning of the 20th century, Anglo-American liberalism was on the defensive. So we want to look at this history of the beginning of the 20th century. The Anglo-American empire, liberal empire, was on the defensive as waves of decolonization and socialism spread around the world. It was the Black radicals in the United States who were among the first to articulate the intrinsic connection between settler empire abroad and settler democracy at home. As the US and the UK opposed the Japanese delegation's demands at the negotiations for the Versailles Conference in 1919 to include an anti-racism clause in the treaty, the US and the UK then were in desperate need of developing a discourse that would divert attention from global white hegemony. Now, as World War II exploded, the US intelligence agencies, that is the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, now they were very clear that Nazi ideology was primarily a radicalization of colonialism. They probably also had a pretty good sense of the deep underlying kinship between Nazi ideology and US settler democracy. Indeed, as we now know, since 2017, the United States provided the model for the Nazi Nuremberg laws. As German jurors traveled to the United States to study its racist laws for emulation, they were actually shocked in some cases by the extremity of the US laws. It's not until the end of World War II, as the United States begins to mobilize and incorporate the remnants of global Nazism and fascism to fight against communism. Now, this includes, of course, the Ukrainian anti-fascist, the Ukrainian fascist anti-communist diaspora. It's not until this moment, just at the end of World War II, that the US begins to spin a tale that Nazism and Nazi ideology should primarily be understood as in terms of authoritarian dictatorship, rather than as a radicalization of the Anglo-American white settler colonial empire and colonial democracy. This transformation was necessary to hide the continuities between Nazism and settler democracy. When I was educated in the United States, and I think it's still the case, we were never told that there could possibly be any continuity between Nazism and things that happen in the United States. Quite the opposite. we were told that there is only a relation of discontinuity between Nazism and US democracy. Hence, the term authoritarianism sits at the juncture or the site of articulation between two forms of historical political repression necessary to the maintenance of global white hegemony in the form of settler empire. It combines a repression of popular multiracial democracy and communism at home with a repression of anti-colonial communist demands abroad, right? And the obsession then with one-party rule that authorizes the equation between Nazism and Stalinism, and then beyond that, Maoism, that's dear to China studies, constitutes an erasure of the common genealogy shared between Nazism and US settler empire. The source of this commonality is located precisely in coloniality. This unacknowledged common genealogical source helps explain why anti-communism in both political formations is always and invariably intrinsically articulated to race and racialization. Or to put it another way, why anti-communism is always anti-Blackness, and anti-Blackness is always related ultimately to some form of anti-communism when you look deep enough. In political terms, China studies' obsession with one-party rule serves to divert attention from the history of settler empire that constitutes the founding exclusions of the discipline. It hardly takes special intelligence or acumen to recognize that China is associated with conspiracy in multiple ways. In the first place, Chinese cultural history, since Mao Zedong's talks at the Yan'an Forum on Art and Literature in 1942, has consistently been narrated as the story of a conspiracy led by the party state to suppress political democracy in China, beginning at the aesthetic level. Hence, a great deal of China watching is concerned with unveiling the machinations of conspiratorial power inside China, localized particularly in the party state. Second, conspiracy marks the founding of exclusions of the field emblematized by the McCarthy-era purges. Hardly buried in the past, contemporary events reveal that behind virtually every social and political challenge faced by global white hegemony today lies an accusation of Chinese infiltration, manipulation, and conspiracy. Unsurprisingly, to go back to Hillenbrand, she is silent about the role that China studies has played in the maintenance and reproduction of the conspiracy theories that have sustained US liberal imperial hegemony since the 1950s to the present. But criticism of Hillenbrand's book would be ultimately misplaced if it remained content to stop at the political without considering the aesthetic. For it is in terms of the aesthetic that Hillenbrand's book is most ambitious. Here again, I find myself in fundamental disagreement with her approach, especially in terms of the aesthetic problems of the figure and the image, precisely those issues that were absolutely central to Chinese socialist aesthetics and to which Mao Zedong's 1942 Yan'an talks directly refer, in a gesture that has consistently been ignored and misrecognized by several generations of China studies scholars. It's one thing to criticize the perlocutionary effects of Mao's talks. It's another thing entirely to criticize Mao without understanding the discourse of the figure, the type, and the image into which he intervened. In the introduction to Hillenbrand's work, Carlos Rojas claims that she mobilizes Walter Benjamin's idea of the optical unconscious. While Rojas is obviously deeply familiar and learned about the Benjaminian context and takes great care to emphasize that Hillenbrand herself does not explicitly refer to Benjamin, the comparison he draws is not persuasive. The reason, quite simply, is that Hillenbrand's approach to the public secret bears no relation to the possibility of a critique of the social totality. This is a possibility that would have necessarily interested anyone adopting a Marxist approach, such as Walter Benjamin. It forms a significant part of my work, and I discuss this problem of the critique of the social totality and the disappearance of the possibility of a critique of the social totality and the historical implications of this in my book. For this reason, I think Frederick Jameson's earlier attempts to develop a methodology of aesthetic criticism that would link the collective unconscious to the unrepresentable social totality are important today, particularly for China studies, in the sense that he was the first critic to explicitly correlate the rise of conspiracy theory to the demise of theories of the social totality, two things of which the China studies field as a whole seems to be incapable of doing due to its ongoing investments in the founding exclusions of the field. Now, what I also show in the book is that this isn't just something that happens in the halls of the ivory tower in North American and other global academic sites, but really informs the epistemic terrain of the discursive terrain in Taiwan. And that the Taiwan Consensus is fully within this ethos of area studies. That on the face of it, because I get often the response from people hearing the critique of area studies who then say, okay, well, that's something that happens in North America or happens in Western Europe or outside basically of the Sinophone world. But when we do this ourselves, it's a totally different thing. I go into this extensively in my book to show that this is simply this kind of exteriority based on nativist claims doesn't hold water, doesn't work. How am I doing for time? I think I've kind of used up my time there.
All right. Sorry, I unmuted myself. How about, it's almost 6, but we started a little bit later. Is a couple more minutes okay to kind of sum up, because then we'll open up and we'll talk more.
Yeah, I'd like to do that. I'd like to open it up. Also because especially maybe there are a couple people who might have read parts of the book in advance. And if so, it'd be really interesting to have some questions and feedback. Yeah. So there are other references I could make. I'll just skip over them to recent work that deals with either the problem of the spectral or spectrality or the epistemology of the secret in area studies, but do it in a way that I find deeply unsatisfying. And I could talk about some of that work to highlight what's different about the approach I'm trying to develop here. But instead, I think I'll also end by pointing out one of the questions that my book tries to pose, which is directly related to this problem of the critique or the possibility of a critique of the social totality that used to be central to a Marxist approach, is I posed essentially the question of what would be the form of area studies that would be devoted to breaking the aerial configuration of knowledge production. And this is a question that's essentially parallel to the very classic Marxist question of what would be a state devoted to the end of the state. in a situation where Marxists understand, of course, the state for Marxists is always a state of class. It's always a state of class. So that's a question that underlies the book, posing that question. And one of the ways I try to answer that is at a theoretical level. There's a whole section of the book where I go and look at the work of some Japanese Marxists and then some American and Canadian-based, some North American-based Japanologists who are continuing that tradition established by the unorthodox Japanese Marxist Uno Kozo, to develop a theoretical explanation of what Marxists call, since Althusser called reproduction in capitalist regimes of accumulation. And I focus particularly on the appropriation of the outside as this particularly essential moment for the capital relation. Capital being something that is actually outside the social relationship, but wants to create this image of being totally internal to it and a natural part of it. And it does this in order to solve the problem of how to reproduce the one thing that capital can't make itself, which is commodified labor, right? Capital can make everything else. The one thing it just can't make is labor, which is the other part of what I'm calling the capital relation. We should remember, of course, that capital in a Marxist explanation isn't a thing. It isn't money. It's a social relationship. It's the abstraction of a social relationship between the capitalist and the worker. That's the capital relation. And the problem is that the commodification of labor isn't something that's just given. It isn't something that just naturally happens. It's actually fraught. It's a very fraught process, and it requires then a kind of securitization in order to make that process go as smoothly as possible for capital. And that consists of an appropriation of the outside, which is what I try to theorize by summarizing this pioneering work done by people in Japan and Japan studies, inspired by the work of the Japanese Marxist Uno Kozo. So there is also that theoretical attempt. The book is a mixture of highly dense and attempts at dense theory, but also it's definitely what do you call it? Peppered or salted with long passages that are extremely concrete and go into very specific detail about funding regimes, financialization, military deployment, et cetera, that constitute both the US global military deployment as part of Pax Americana and Taiwan's position within that.
Yeah.
Right. All righty. So I think I'll stop there. Thanks a lot for giving me a chance to present all that.
Well, thank you very much, Jon. That's really terrific. And oh, am I on there? Sorry. Yeah. So I think that